You have come here because something in you will not rest. It stirs beneath the surface, not loud but persistent, not chaotic but undeniable. Perhaps it has shown itself as exhaustion, the kind that sleep cannot fix, or a strange heaviness, a pressure that feels not entirely your own. Perhaps you have carried emotions like grief, rage, fear, and could never fully explain where they came from. You feel things deeply. Too deeply, some have said. You've been told that your sensitivity is a flaw, a curse that makes you fragile in a world built for the indifferent. That you are too porous, too exposed, too easily overwhelmed. That you are destined to suffer because you care too much. And so, over time, you began to wonder if they were right. But what if the very thing you were taught to repress is the source of a hidden power? Carl Jung did not romanticize suffering. He did not glorify emotional pain. But through decades of observation, he uncovered something profound. Something most people never discover because they never dare to descend deep enough into themselves to see it. Jung's most transformative insight wasn't just about empathy. It was about what happens when a highly sensitive individual, an empath, refuses to be destroyed by their wound. When they stop identifying with their pain and begin integrating their shadow. When they stop collapsing into suffering and begin transforming it into strength. This, Jung discovered, is not merely personal healing. It is individuation, the central task of the human psyche. The journey from unconscious fragmentation toward wholeness. The empath's pain is not a dead end. It is a threshold. And those who dare to cross it do not simply heal. They undergo what Jung called alchemical transformation. They emerge with conscious empathy, feeling without drowning, loving without losing themselves, serving others without self-erasure. This is the journey from wounded to warrior. It is not metaphorical, it is archetypal. And today, we will walk that path, step by step, through the very psychology that made Carl Jung one of the most revolutionary minds of the 20th century. Because the rise of the empath is no longer optional, it is necessary. Let us begin. Carl Jung saw what most others missed, that beneath the wounds of the sensitive lies something far more ancient than trauma. He observed that some individuals carried within them the echo of a profound paradox, the ability to help others heal while remaining unable to heal themselves. This was no coincidence. It was an archetype, one Jung came to call the wounded healer. Its lineage stretches back through time, to Chiron, the centaur of Greek mythology, wounded by a poisoned arrow that could never be removed. Though unable to heal himself, Chiron became a teacher, a guide, a healer of gods and men. To Christ on the cross, bleeding yet transcending, holding the agony of the world in his body. To mystics and prophets, to sages and visionaries who felt too much, carried too much, and yet turned their suffering into wisdom. To be an empath is to walk this lineage. But most do not know this. They believe their pain is a flaw. They believe their oversensitivity is something to hide, suppress, or fix. But Jung saw the truth. This pain is not random. It is archetypal. It is the beginning of individuation, if the empath is willing to face what they have long denied. What must be faced is not just the pain, but the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is everything we have disowned in ourselves. It is the psychic basement where we store the traits we believe are too dangerous to express. Anger, selfishness, hunger for power, assertiveness, even healthy pride. For the empath, the shadow is especially intense because they have spent a lifetime projecting these qualities onto others. I am the loving one, they say. I carry others. I don't get angry. And in doing so, they cast enormous reservoirs of psychic energy into the unconscious. This leads to what Jung called wound identification, the process by which a person fuses their sense of self with their trauma. I am my pain. I am my sadness. I am broken. But Jung warned, when a wound becomes an identity, healing becomes a threat. This is what he later termed wound attachment syndrome, the psychological addiction to staying hurt. Because if the empath heals, who will they be? If they no longer suffer, will they still be special? Will they still be loved? And so they resist their own healing, not consciously, but subtly. They cling to their wound as if it were their most precious possession. But this, Jung insisted, is the turning point. To remain attached to the wound is to remain in the basement of the psyche, forever haunted by ghosts we refuse to name. To rise, to individuate, one must descend. One must enter the shadow. And there, in the dark, discover what Jung called the sword of clarity. This is not the sword of violence. It is not used to dominate, conquer, or destroy. It is the sword that cuts illusion. It severs false attachments. It says no without guilt. It reclaims the parts of you that were disowned in the name of being good. The monster in your dream? That's not punishment. That's your repressed power. The battlefield? That's your inner life. And the empath who learns to stand in that battlefield, who chooses not to flee when the shadow appears, reclaims a piece of themselves that had long been banished. Because the warrior does not emerge from denial. The warrior emerges when the soul refuses annihilation. When the empath, long drained by the needs of others, finally sees, I was not made to bleed endlessly. I was made to rise whole. But the shadow does not only contain rage and power. It also holds the most seductive force of all, powerlessness. Jung observed that many empaths unconsciously become addicted to their own suffering. This is not weakness. It is a complex psychological defense, a form of survival. Over time, they develop what he described as powerlessness addiction, a psychic loop that keeps them safe by keeping them small. Why? Because power demands responsibility. Healing demands choice. To stand in one's own strength means risking rejection, risking failure, risking the loss of relationships built upon unspoken sacrifice. So the empath, in subtle and unconscious ways, chooses to remain wounded. The victim identity becomes a shield, a way to avoid difficult decisions, avoid being seen as selfish, avoid the terrifying task of individuation. This is where the empath falls into inverse power, a dynamic where they control others not through dominance, but through helplessness. They may not speak their needs directly, but they elicit care through exhaustion. They may not demand, but they guilt. They may not express boundaries, but they expect others to intuit their pain. Jung warned that this pattern drains not only the empath, but everyone around them. It creates dependency, not connection. Manipulation, not intimacy. At its extreme, this becomes what Jung called suffering as currency. Pain becomes the empath's proof of moral superiority. The more they hurt, the more righteous they feel. I suffer, therefore I am good. This subtle form of suffering narcissism elevates pain into a virtue, turning wounds into credentials rather than material for growth. And among empaths, this often leads to the Olympics of pain, unspoken competitions about who has been hurt more, who has suffered longer, who has endured the most. But Jung insisted, Wounds are not for comparison. They are for transformation. The tragedy, he noted, is that many empaths fear becoming the oppressor if they step into their own power. They associate all strength with those who once harmed them. They believe that to assert is to dominate, to protect oneself is to become cold, to say no is to become cruel. But this is the great illusion. Jung wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." What we reject in ourselves returns through projection. What we repress becomes the script we live, until we finally choose to step out of the role of the victim and claim authorship over our own life. And that journey, from unconscious suffering to conscious strength, is not abstract. It unfolds in distinct stages. Jung documented what he came to understand as the 4 archetypal stages of empathic evolution. This is not a checklist. It is a spiral path, each stage revisited as life deepens. The first is the unconscious absorber. At this stage, the empath does not yet recognize their gift, only its weight. They are overwhelmed by the emotions of others, constantly flooded, unable to distinguish between their own pain and that which they absorb. They become magnets for chaos, for toxicity, for drama, because pain, unconsciously, has become their identity. They do not yet see that their sensitivity is information. They only feel cursed. But something happens. A crack in perception, a realization. This isn't punishment, this is a message. And that realization opens the door to the second stage, the wounded helper. Here, the empath begins to use their pain to support others. They become the listener, the caretaker, the intuitive healer. But they still carry the illusion that their wound is the source of their gift, that without suffering, they would lose their ability to connect. And so they continue to carry what no longer belongs to them, believing that empathy requires depletion. They help others, but cannot help themselves. Jung observed that this is often where empaths stay stuck, because the helper archetype is socially rewarded. But beneath the performance of compassion, their own shadow begins to stir. And eventually, they are called into the third stage, the shadow integrator. This is the descent, the underworld, where the empath must face everything they've disowned: their rage, their selfishness, their desire to say no. This stage is terrifying because it shatters the identity of the good empath. It asks them to feel what they have long repressed, to reclaim what they feared would make them monstrous. But this is the paradox Jung revealed. Only by integrating the shadow does the empath become truly whole. Only by embracing the darkness do they become capable of authentic light. And from that integration comes the final stage, the integrated warrior, no longer reactive, no longer self-sacrificing, no longer addicted to pain. Here, the empath develops what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel deeply without losing self, to love without leaking energy, to hold others' pain without being consumed. They set boundaries with grace. They speak truth without collapse. They protect their sensitivity not with walls, but with sovereignty. They are the warrior, not in the archetype of Mars, but in the sacred energy of Michael, the archangel. Sword in hand, flame in heart, able to face both shadow and light without flinching. Because now they know, I am not here to be consumed. I am here to awaken. The path from wounded to warrior is not linear, it is not clean, and it is certainly not safe. Carl Jung warned that the process of transformation is among the most psychologically dangerous undertakings a person can endure. It is not about gradual improvement. It is about death, the death of false identities, illusions, protections, and personas that once kept you alive, but now keep you small. One of the first hazards is what Jung called identity annihilation. When the empath begins to heal, they often face a deep existential terror. If I am no longer the one who suffers, who am I? For years, perhaps decades, the empath's entire self-concept was built around their pain. Healing doesn't feel liberating at first. It feels like ego death. And then comes the relationship apocalypse. As the empath begins to reclaim boundaries and speak truth, the people who once depended on their silence, their self-erasure, their unending compassion, begin to panic. Partners, family members, even friends may lash out, manipulate, withdraw, or accuse. Why? Because transformation disrupts the system, and those who benefited from your wounded identity will fight to keep you in it. Then there is the shadow terror response, the fear that you're becoming a bad person for expressing repressed emotions, when rage surfaces, when selfishness demands space, when power finally knocks at the door. The empath often recoils. They have spent their lives being good. Now they mistake wholeness for corruption. Jung also observed the trap of spiritual bypass. Some empaths try to skip the descent. They cover the wound with mantras, affirmations, love and light. But shadow cannot be transcended. It must be integrated. If it is avoided, it festers, returning stronger, darker, more chaotic. And finally, there is inflation. The ego swelling that comes when the empath begins to reclaim power. They may feel superior to those still stuck. They may confuse awakening with arrival. But Jung insisted, individuation is not status. It is service, and it requires ongoing humility. Every stage of the empath's rise contains traps. But Jung did not leave us in the dark. He mapped the process, and more importantly, he offered tools. Jung's integration methodology is not theoretical. It is practical. It begins where all transformation begins, in the shadow. He called for active shadow engagement, the deliberate, conscious practice of reclaiming what we've rejected. This means examining our harshest judgments of others and asking, what does this reveal about me? It means engaging with dream figures, monsters, aggressors, seducers, and realizing they are not enemies, but parts of ourselves begging to be seen. It means feeling the forbidden emotions in safe, intentional spaces, letting rage move through the body, letting sorrow speak without censoring it. Jung emphasized, this work is not about becoming selfish or aggressive. It's about becoming complete. The warrior does not amputate parts of the self. The warrior integrates them and chooses what to express with clarity and control. Then comes boundary architecture, one of the most essential skills for the empath. Jung taught that boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They protect sensitivity, not suppress it. He encouraged simple, guilt-free refusals. No, without explanation, recognition of manipulation, and a clear response. And perhaps most importantly, energetic sovereignty, the ability to know what is yours and what is not. Because an empath without boundaries is a sponge. An empath with boundaries is a healer. Next is authentic power development. Jung urged the empath to stop avoiding leadership, stop apologizing for strength, to assert needs clearly, to speak truth even if it shakes the room, to step forward when their insight can serve. Not for control, but contribution. This is not power over. It is power from within. Power that serves both self and others. Power that is conscious, ethical, and rooted in sovereignty. Finally, Jung outlined the process of identity reconstruction. The empath cannot simply abandon the old self. They must build a new one, based not on trauma, but on truth. This involves asking, who am I when I am not hurting? Who am I when I am not needed? Who am I when I am not performing goodness? The answer is not abstract. It is archetypal. It is the healer who heals from wholeness, not from wound. The warrior who serves with compassion and strength. The self that is not shattered by shadow, but built by it. And when this self emerges, it becomes a force that no outer chaos can shake. Jung's insights were not mere theory. They were tested through lived lives. He studied not only the descent, but the aftermath. And in those who rose, he saw patterns of successful integration, as well as tragic stagnation. Consider Viktor Frankl, who survived the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust. He did not emerge clinging to his victimhood. Instead, he transformed his suffering into logotherapy, a school of psychotherapy based on finding meaning in pain. He became a living example of what Jung called meaning-making integration, turning the wound into wisdom, the trauma into transcendence. Frankl's empathy was not diminished by his suffering. It was deepened. But it was also bounded by strength, so he could serve without being destroyed by the pain of others. Then there is Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, betrayed, beaten, oppressed. And yet, he emerged not as a destroyer, but as a leader who integrated both rage and compassion. He held his oppressors accountable without becoming their mirror. His strength did not erase his sensitivity. It completed it. Jung would say, they became conscious warriors, individuals who did not bypass the shadow, but transmuted it. But not all who are wounded rise. Jung also documented what he termed the professional victim, individuals who build careers, relationships, and identities around their trauma. They may speak of healing, but unconsciously resist it. Because to let go of the wound would mean letting go of the attention, the specialness, the control it affords. They become what Jung might call trauma entrepreneurs, trading in pain, but never transforming it. And the cost is devastating. They remain trapped, and worse, they trap others with them. Jung insisted, suffering alone does not sanctify, only integration does. When the empath does integrate, when they pass through the descent, reclaim the shadow, dismantle false identities, and reconstruct from truth, what emerges is not merely a healed person. What emerges is sovereignty. Jung defined sovereignty not as control over others, but mastery of the self. The sovereign empath is not a reed, bent by every emotional current. They are a tree with deep roots. They feel the wind, yes, but they do not break. They can witness suffering without collapsing. They can offer love without self-erasure. They can remain open without being overwhelmed. They are no longer compulsively kind. They are consciously compassionate. And this, Jung believed, is not just a personal triumph. It is a collective necessity. Because when an empath rises, they do not rise alone. Their very presence becomes a beacon in the dark. They radiate truth, and others feel it. They model what is possible, not by preaching, but by being. This is what Jung called the role of the culture bearer. An individual who carries forward not just personal healing, but archetypal evolution. A soul who, by individuating, contributes to the maturation of the collective unconscious itself. Our world is drowning in denied shadow, in mechanized systems, in compassion without boundaries. We do not need more sentimentality. We need the union of opposites. Sensitivity pulse strength, empathy pulse sovereignty, light pulse shadow. The warrior empath carries this union. They are the midwives of a new psychological era, one where feeling is not weakness and strength is not domination. Where helping does not require self-destruction, where love does not mean collapse, but sovereignty requires sacrifice. To rise into this role, the empath must let die the identities that once defined them. The pleaser, the martyr, the unbreakable caregiver. Jung warned, the psyche resists this death. It will trigger dreams of chaos. It will summon tests of boundary. The people around you will not understand. But the shadow will whisper, do not betray yourself again. And every time you choose differently, every time you say no without guilt, walk away without collapse, love without losing yourself, the warrior grows stronger. This is not an overnight shift. It is a spiral initiation. You will revisit the wound. You will face the darkness again. But now you bring a sword. Now you are sovereign. And now you are ready to serve not from suffering, but from wholeness. The world needs you, not as the one who absorbs everything, but as the one who stands, not as the one who fixes others, but as the one who mirrors their strength. This is how the empath becomes unstoppable, because they are no longer escaping pain. They are alchemizing it, not just for themselves, but for all of us. The empath's rise is not gentle. It is not linear. It is not always beautiful. It is a cracking open, a burning down. It is the death of illusions and the birth of sovereignty. It is learning to sit in fire and discovering that you do not burn. Jung taught that individuation is the highest aim of the psyche, not perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness is born through paradox. The wound becomes the wisdom. The shadow becomes the strength. The sensitivity becomes the sword. The warrior still bleeds, but they no longer fear their own blood. They carry their scars not as shame, but as symbols of initiation. And when others see them, standing tall, clear-eyed, compassionate but unshakable, they begin to believe, maybe I can rise too. This is the ripple effect of archetype. When one empath rises, it creates space for others to follow. And this is why your journey matters, not just for you, but for the collective. Because when the world is torn apart by unconsciousness and cruelty, the empath who has integrated becomes essential, not as a victim, but as a warrior of soul. If you have heard your story in this, if you felt the pull of your own power rising beneath the pain, then let this be your turning point. You are not too much. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are becoming whole. And if you're ready to claim that truth, then speak it. In the comments, write, I choose warrior over victim. Because the world needs more empaths who do not collapse, but rise. And your rise is unstoppable.